One of the most memorable scenes from the life of Jesus occurs in the 11th chapter of Mark's Gospel. He arrives in Jerusalem and immediately visits his wrath upon the temple complex, overturning tables and driving out those men whose job it was to provide ritually pure offerings to pilgrims to the temple, such as doves without blemish and coins that were not stamped with the heads of Roman emperors. This cleansing of the temple serves as the foundation for Christianity and summarizes the entirety of Jesus' message. The old ways were corrupt, and he was sent to set things to rights. And surrounding this popular scene was another, the cursing of the fig trees. When the disciples see the fig trees after Jesus' visit to the temple and notice they're withered and dying, Peter recalls how, upon arrival at Jerusalem, those trees were cursed by Jesus for failing to provide fruit. This is seen as an allegory for the temple itself. The inability for the temple to feed the spirits of the people is what led Jesus to oust those who were in power. Though neither of these popular scenes originated with the Jewish carpenter from Galilee, but from literary sources penned centuries earlier by people who took umbrage with another temple built on the same ground. I'm your host, Jason, and you're listening to Dragons in Genesis. Amos the prophet, according to the text, is from the southern kingdom of Judah, but preached in the northern kingdom of Israel around 760 BCE during the reign of King Jeroboam II. Also, according to the opening lines of the book, he wasn't actually a prophet, but a breeder of sheep and a dresser of sycamore trees. This could have meant he cared for Sycamore Grove, which would be in line with prophetic works, as many received their visions beneath shade trees, as we saw in the Book of Judges with Deborah. But it could also be a reference to the sycamore fig, meaning he would have maintained a fruit orchard. Details such as these aren't unheard of when it comes to prophets. The idea that they're not qualified to be a prophet is meant to exemplify the divine providence of their message. A mere shepherd or a farmer couldn't write such a book unless, of course, it was divinely inspired. This exact same argument would later be used for Muhammad, who was said to be an illiterate merchant, though merchants were among the educated who had to learn reading and writing as part of their occupation. Another motive for mentioning that he was a successful breeder of sheep and dresser of trees is to remove the idea that serving as a prophet was for financial gain. By claiming that the author was financially stable, it removes the idea that he needed to give prophecy to sustain his household. As for the authorship of this book, scholars point to variations in the writing style and references to later events, as evidence of ongoing redaction spanning centuries. However, this could also be explained by simply placing the composition in the post-exilic period. Finally, we come to the compositional structure of this book. The 9 chapters of Amos can be divided into 3 parts. The first 2 chapters are the oracles against the nations. Chapters 3 through 6 contains the announcement of judgment. And the final 3 chapters contain the visions of the end. With a few brief exceptions, the entirety of Amos is written as poetic oracles. So let's get started. The opening lines of the book tell us that what follows are the words of Amos, a sheep breeder from Tekoa. According to 2 Chronicles, this town is in the hill country of Judah. Amos receives visions concerning the fate of Israel 2 years before the earthquake. We're to assume this was the same earthquake during the reign of Uzziah, king of Judah, who ruled during the same time as Jeroboam in Israel. The earthquake is mentioned again in Zechariah 14, and its use as an instrument of Yahweh's wrath and linkage with the Day of Judgment will prompt later authors to include it in the tales of Jesus. After this brief introduction, we come to the first section of Amos, the oracles against the nation. We're told that what follows are the words of Amos, but instantly greeted with the roaring of Yahweh, who voices his anger from Jerusalem, as he speaks of the crimes of Aram, Philistia, Tyre, Edom, Ammon, Moab, Judah, and finally, of Israel. He begins by saying, "For 3 crimes of Damascus, and now 4, a formula that we've seen before. This X and X plus 1 formula is used to express the severity of the sins committed by the guilty party. It's like when those infomercial guys show you all the stuff that their food slicer can do and then say, but wait, there's more, and then show you one more thing to get you to buy their product. Yahweh says that he will not revoke his wrath because Aram threshed Gilead with sledges of iron. And at this point, we should all be quite familiar with the use of harvest imagery in association with judgment and destruction, so this should come as no surprise. Because of their treatment of Gilead, the region east of the Jordan River, Yahweh will send fire against the Arameans and shatter the gates of Damascus before sending their people into exile, the same fate which he inflicted upon the Israelites and later Judahites. This mention of Gilead is a reference to the invasion in 2 Kings 13, when the Transjordan region was seized and occupied. Yahweh then turns his anger on the Philistines, stating, "For 3 crimes of Gaza, and now 4," and then names their crime for exiling a population and handing them over to the Edomites. Like the Arameans, they too will suffer Yahweh's wrath as he sends devouring flames upon their strongholds and removes kings from their thrones. The people will perish as Yahweh turns his hand against them, and the cities of Ashdod, Ashkelon, and Ekron will all fall. The same crimes are listed for Tyre, handing over a population to the Edomites, but added to it is the crime of forgetting their covenant of brotherhood with Israel. This language is understood as the violation of some treaty. While Tyre was an ally of Israel, it seems that the author of Amos sees it as one which abandoned its neighbors in their time of need. Like those previous nations, it too will see fire come to devour its strongholds and tear down its walls. When Yahweh turns his wrath on Edom, he calls the nation his brother, a reference to the Jacob and Esau story, in which Esau is depicted as the progenitor of the Edomites, while Jacob is the father of all of the Israelites. Here, the nation isn't only abandoning its place as a member of the Davidic Empire, but betraying its own brother. The land is also accused of abandoning mercy and persisting in wrath against Israel beyond what was necessary. This isn't just war, this is excessive brutality. This theme continues in the accusation against Ammon, as the Ammonites rip open the bellies of pregnant women, committing genocide to expand their territories. Because of those crimes, Yahweh will come against them as a devouring fire and a raging tempest, attacking kings and princes and sending their royalty into exile. This gives us another example of Yahweh being depicted as a storm god and visiting the fate of the Israelites and Judahites on their enemies. The Moabites introduce a new crime in the beginning of chapter 2 as they burn the bones of the Edomite kings. Originally, the people of this region buried their dead in peaceful and scenic places, especially those which held religious significance, such as near groves of trees, hilltops, culturally significant valleys, and inside of caves where they received visions. Later, as Persian influence crept into their culture, they stored bodies until the flesh had rotted away or been devoured by insects, and then gathered up the dry bones and placed them inside of clay or stone vessels called ossuaries. These were then kept in family crypts. Doing so, preserving the bones of the dead, allowed the spirits to rest peacefully. But here, the Moabites are accused of burning these bones, cursing the spirits of the dead to wander restlessly. It was a particularly heinous crime, one which earns them a special punishment from Yahweh. Not only will he devour their strongholds as he does with previous nations, he will personally slay their royalty, and the nation will taste death in its entirety as he blows the horn of war against it. Judah's crime is spurning the instructions given to them by Yahweh and following the lies told to them by their ancestors, which led the population astray. This, of course, is a reference to ancient Hebrew polytheism, which later prophets and priests have rejected. Israel is accused of injustice against its own population, judges accepting bribes and selling out the poor and the lowly. Another crime levied against them is the father and son sleeping with the same girl. While this might be a reference to a father taking his son's wife, it could also be a coded reference to the abuse of power. Wealthy and powerful men oppressing the poor and helpless. Though we must also consider that the phrase holds a double meaning, accusing the Israelites of improper relations and social oppression. There's a mention that the people take garments in a pledge, which is a reference to the practice of returning borrowed goods before nightfall so the owner wouldn't have to sleep uncovered. This is found in Exodus 22:25 and Deuteronomy 24:12. They also drink wine in the temples while reclining beside Yahweh's altar, a reference to drunkenness and excessive feast for the wealthy, using funds from the temple to finance what amounted to parties. Because of their corruption, Yahweh will destroy them like trees, rotting their fruit above and their roots below. This too will be used in later centuries for the story of Jesus, as he speaks against the temple corruption and compares the people to fruit trees, which he curses and kills. The swifter among them shall be slowed and unable to escape, and the mightiest of warriors will be unable to defend themselves in battle. All will lose courage and flee on the day of Yahweh. The middle section of Amos is called the Announcement of Judgment and covers chapters 3 through 6. It begins with 3 summons to hear the word of Yahweh, which covers chapters 3, 4, and the first 9 verses of chapter 5. The first summons, in chapter 3, begins with a pronouncement that the oracle concerns the entirety of the chosen people, who Yahweh has brought up from Egypt. It isn't clear at this point if this is a reference to the Exodus story or not. In previous episodes, we've seen how the flight to Egypt was something that occurred after Yahweh vented his wrath against the northern and southern kingdoms of Israel and Judah, during the invasions of the Assyrians and Babylonians, respectively. It was only later that the Moses story would be developed and placed into the distant past to serve as part of their national history. So when we read of the Israelites being brought up from Egypt, this shouldn't necessarily be considered a reference to the story of the Exodus involving their mythic history. Rather, we should see it as a reference to the refugees who fled to Egypt following the collapse of Israel and Judah, who later returned to Judah following the restoration of Jerusalem under their Persian rulers. The story of Moses and the 400-year exile in Egypt hasn't been invented yet at the time of the writing of Amos. Yahweh continues by stating that he has known only his family, meaning the Israelites, among all of the families of earth, and since they were his people, it's he who will punish them for their iniquities. We must mention here that the Israelites weren't the only people to worship Yahweh. He was a popular deity for thousands of years in the eastern Mediterranean world. To establish the relationship between Yahweh and his people, he gives a series of examples found in nature posed as rhetorical questions. Do 2 journey together unless they have agreed? Does a lion roar in the forest when it has no prey? Does a young lion cry out from its den unless it has seized something? Does a bird swoop down on a trap on the ground where there is no lure for it? Does a snare spring up from the ground without catching anything? Does the ram's horn sound in a city without the people becoming frightened? Does disaster befall a city unless Yahweh has caused it? The opening question, do 2 journey together unless they have agreed, isn't referring to a spring break road trip. It's recalling the covenant between Yahweh and the nation, the idea which establishes the nation. This is a suzerainty land grant which lies behind documents such as Deuteronomy. A powerful nation establishes the right for a subservient nation to exist, with the understanding that self-governorship applies only in certain instances. In important matters, the weaker nation must either refer to a document which outlines their role in such matters, or seek the guidance from the superior nation. Israel first encountered this idea with the Assyrian Empire. As we see now, the idea has become so ubiquitous that it's even permeated their theology. In the post-exilic period, when existence in their own homeland was uncertain, their religion and national identity was being framed as such a land grant. The following lines demonstrate the superiority of their master and hint ominously of their fate should they disappoint him. Does a lion roar in the forest when it has no prey? Does the ram's horn sound in a city without the people becoming frightened? Countless times we've seen how Yahweh is portrayed as a lion hunting his own people, devouring them and ripping open their flesh. It's a visceral threat that permeates the prophetic material. We've also seen references to the prophets standing as sentry to alert the people of the coming dangers that Yahweh personally brings against the city. The people are meant to fear their God, and that fear is meant to stir them into action. The passage ends at verse 6b by removing all doubts as to the topic being discussed. Does disaster befall a city unless Yahweh has caused it? The war god of their pantheon is moving against the nation, stalking like a lion on the hunt. Prophets sound the warning, and the people are stricken with terror, but devastation comes for them anyway. As rival gods are gradually expunged from their religion, there are no enemy deities to serve as an explanation for evil and calamity, so Yahweh is the master of all. Good and evil, creation and destruction, feast and famine, all are in the domain of this singular deity. Until older deities are repurposed to serve as the personification of evil, Yahweh must serve as its creator. This is in line with Isaiah 45:7, when Yahweh decrees, I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create evil. I, Yahweh, do all these things. This message is to be proclaimed in Assyria and Egypt. Amos invites these two empires together with him in Samaria to see the oppression and corruption in the land, a harsh chastisement against the northern kingdom of Israel, when even its enemies would be appalled by the actions of the people. Because of their sins, they're met with violence and destruction as strongholds fall to the enemies that Yahweh gathers against them. Those who survive escape only with meager remnants of their belongings. The altars at Bethel will not escape Yahweh's wrath either. Its horns will be broken off and thrown to the ground, and the temples will lie in ruin, a judgment against those temples that Jerusalem sees as inferior to its own. Chapter 4 gives us our second summons to hear the oracles of Yahweh. It begins by addressing the pampered women who live near Samaria by saying, Hear this word, you cows of Bashan. This area was known for its fertile pastures and plump herds. Also, women love being compared to livestock, so jot that down, fellas. They're accused of oppressing the poor and the needy, and getting drunk, which reminds me of those groups of women who leave church and head over to Chili's for some Sunday afternoon margaritas and berate the waitstaff. So this might be a prophecy about those people, or maybe not. Whomever it's about, Yahweh informs them that they'll be dragged off with ropes and their children will be hauled away with fishhooks. This is the same language used when Yahweh fights Leviathan, the great chaos dragon. It is hooked and hauled ashore with rope before being slaughtered. The people will be exiled to the northern end of Israel, to an area under Assyrian control. As in the previous oracle, Amos invites people to visit Bethel and witness the sin perpetrated there. They worship and offer sacrifice to Yahweh, but without justice, their actions are rejected by the deity as abominations. As punishment, Yahweh curses them with famine. He rejects their bread offerings and causes scarcity of food in all their cities. Rain is withheld and their harvests fail as crops shrivel and die. And when they still failed to follow Yahweh properly, he sent disease and locusts to further ruin their fields. Following that, he moved among them with a sword, slaughtering their young men and horses, both symbols of military might. These cities were overthrown like those of Sodom and Gomorrah. He can do all this because Yahweh Sabaoth, the Lord of the heavenly army, is the same God who formed the mountains, dictates the thoughts of morals, and walks among the highest peaks of the earth, and turns day into night. The first half of chapter 5 brings us our third summons to hear the words of Yahweh. He announces that the house of Israel has fallen, to rise no more. She lies abandoned on her land with no one to lift her up. The populations of her cities are decimated, and the worship centers of Gilgal and Bethel are destroyed. Yahweh flares up against the nation like a wildfire, consuming the land and its people. He is unstoppable, creator of the Pleiades and Orion, and brings the rising sun. If you need to understand the significance of constellations and Yahweh's judgment, see episode 52, where we deep dive into this topic. Yahweh, the creator of the world, brings destruction to cities and torrential floods to the surface of the earth. This is the cleansing flood that returns the world to its pre-creation state. The second half of chapter 5 brings us the three woes, which concludes in chapter 6. Something of note here is that chapter 5, verse 7 is out of place. The line actually belongs after verse 9. It is not part of the third summons, but is in fact the beginning of the first woe in the next section. So the third summons is chapter 5, verses 1 through 6, and verses 8 through 9. Then the first woe is chapter 5, verse 7, and verses 10 to 17. It begins, "Woe to those who turn justice into wormwood and cast righteousness to the ground." The oracle goes on to identify the wicked by their behaviors, such as despising those who speak with integrity, oppressing the just, accepting bribes, and turning away the needy at the gates. They tax the destitute and enrich themselves. Because of this, they shall not live in their own homes or drink the wine from their own vineyards. The author encourages the audience to set aside their evil ways and to seek justice. Only then will Yahweh Sabaoth have pity on the remnant of the population. The second woe warns those who long for the day of Yahweh to be careful what they wish for. As we've encountered before in the prophetic works, the coming of Yahweh will no longer be a day of light and triumph, but one of darkness and terror. Their disappointment at Yahweh's arrival is likened to one fleeing from a lion, only to encounter a bear, or returning home to safety, only to receive a snake bite. Yahweh despises their worship, sacrifices, singing, and prayers because of their sins, which include committing grave injustices and worshiping other gods associated with prominent stars. Because of these sins, they'll be exiled beyond Damascus. Chapter 6 brings us the third and final woe. This time, Yahweh directs his wrath at the leaders of worship in sacred sites, like Zion and Mount Gerizim. They should be leaders of the chosen people, first among nations, yet their crimes hasten their destruction. They bask in wealth, sleeping on beds of ivory, and anoint themselves with the finest oil, but will be the first to be sent into exile. They're too prideful, both the people and their cities, so they'll be torn down and reduced. People will drag the bodies of their dead relatives into the streets and shun the name of Yahweh for fear that he will bring further destruction and death. The third and final section of the Book of Amos is the Visions of the End, which covers chapters 7, 8, and 9. This section is comprised of a series of 5 collected oracles presented as divine visions, beginning with the plague sent by Yahweh and culminating with the destruction of the temple. As we've seen before, details which will later be used in the Exodus narrative to forge a unified national identity already appear in the prophetic works, and this is true again with chapter 7. The series of visions kicks off with the plague of locusts, as we saw at the end of the last episode with the book of Joel, though this author doesn't devote an entire book to the bugs. I'm afraid we only get 3 verses. And as before, the locusts are a metaphor for both Yahweh's wrath and the invading army which serves as instrument of that wrath. The author is shown a growing swarm of locusts that flies into the land, devouring all the grass. The people then plead to Yahweh, asking him to raise up the people who have fallen to this plague, to which Yahweh relents and recalls his plague, sparing some small remnant. In this vision, the prophet intercedes on behalf of the people and sways Yahweh's opinion, preventing total destruction of the chosen nation. We've seen this before in the story of Abraham, when he asked Yahweh to spare Sodom if he can find a few righteous people in the city. In that story, only Lot and his family, relatives of Abraham, are spared. The second vision is the rain of fire, which will also be co-opted for the Exodus story when that version of their national history is crafted. Here, Yahweh is summoning a storm of flames to destroy the land. It first consumed the abyss, and now is devouring the fields as the locusts had done. And again, the prophet steps forth to plead with his deity, reminding the god that if he continued on his path of destruction, he would have no more people to worship him. Yahweh looks on at the helpless population and sees their plight, and again he relents. The third is the vision of the plummet. Now, the plummet isn't a vision of a fall, but a different meaning of the word plummet. In this case, it's a tool used in construction. A plummet is a long string with a pointed weight on one end. Let's say you need to build a wall, and you'd like it to be straight and even. The further up you go, the less likely you are to be able to keep it straight. So what do? You mark the foundation of the wall. Then you climb up on a ladder and you dangle a plummet from your hand and slowly move it until the weighted tip is directly over the markings on the ground. This tells you exactly where the top of the wall needs to be. You can then erect a couple of poles and stretch a cord between them to serve as a guide. As long as that cord intersects the point where the plummet was located, the builders can use it as a target. When they reach that target, the wall will be straight and even. If you've ever seen a video of bricklayers building a wall, you'll likely see a cord stretched over the top of their work, serving as such a guide. Often the location of that string was determined through the use of a plummet, which you can still buy at your local hardware store. They're now called plumb bobs, but it's the same tool that humans have been using for thousands of years. So, in chapter 7, verse 7, the prophet sees another vision. This time, Yahweh is standing on a properly built wall, plummet in hand, asking Amos what he sees. Amos replies, "A plummet." Yahweh then informs the prophet that he's using a plummet to measure the people, and shall forgive them no longer. In other words, Yahweh has provided the people with the means of following him properly, but they failed in this task. The plummet represents the prophets and his covenant, which serves as their target. But despite this, they've missed their target and gone astray. He showed them how to build an even wall and provided the tools to do so, but they've ignored his instruction. Because of this, he'll lay waste to them and their sanctuaries. Their walls, straight or otherwise, will be torn down as he attacks his own people with the sword. No longer will Yahweh wield tools of construction, but now he swings weapons of devastation. Just as the first two visions ended on a note of hope, with Yahweh relenting, the third vision concludes with definitive and unrelenting wrath. No longer will he forgive their sins and ignore their transgressions. The chapter then ends with something known as a biographical interlude. Interrupting these series of visions is a brief story about the prophet himself. This interlude begins in verse 10 and completes chapter 7. Amaziah, a priest in Bethel, sent word to King Jeroboam of Israel, accusing the prophet of conspiring against the king and the nation. He claims that the prophet's words are too disruptive for the people to hear, and his message of looming exile erodes the morale and loyalty of the population. We hear no response from the king, but we don't need one, as Amaziah takes it upon himself to order Amos's exile, commanding the prophet to flee to the land of Judah, and forbidding him from ever again giving prophecy in Bethel. To this, Amos responds that he isn't even a prophet, but a herdsman and a dresser of sycamore trees who merely records the words that Yahweh speaks to him. He follows this up with, to no one's surprise, another prophecy. In response to Amaziah's command to cease giving prophecy in Israel, Yahweh says that Amaziah's wife will become a prostitute, and his children will be struck down by the sword. The land of Israel will then be parceled out to invaders, and all of its people will be exiled, which is all a pretty harsh punishment for telling one man to get lost. Of course, this has nothing to do with Amos or Amaziah. They're stand-ins for the problem these prophets are speaking against. Amaziah represents the corrupt priesthood, and Amos represents the prophets attempting to get the nation back on track. His wife and her prostitution represent the people going astray and worshiping other gods, while the slaughtered children represent the casualties of war. But if you've been following this podcast for any length of time, then you likely already knew that. The fourth vision is the vision of summer fruit. Amos is shown a vision and asked by Yahweh what he sees. The prophet responds that he sees a basket of summer fruit. As we would expect, a symbol of harvest is followed by scenes of judgment. Yahweh declares that an end has come to his people. Temple songs will become wailing of pain and despair as dead bodies pile up in the streets. This indicates that it's temple authorities who incite Yahweh's wrath. Those who mistreat the poor and needy will suffer the most. They'll be unable to sell grain or wheat, and the value of things shall be overturned. An ephah shall be made small, and a shekel will be made great, as merchants use false scales to deceive the poor. And that gives me an idea for a campaign slogan when I run for president. Make shekels great again. Yahweh then reminds them that he shall never forget any of their deeds, and we're treated to some of that old volcano god imagery when he threatens to send earthquakes against the land as punishment, followed by the threat of floods. And as we've come to expect, he threatens darkness during the daytime, a reversal of the expected, as the arrival of Yahweh is meant to be depicted as the rising sun. This imagery will return during the crucifixion scene in the Gospels, as a midday eclipse becomes part of the narrative, along with earthquakes, temple damage, and mass resurrections. The nation is threatened with famine and exile as the prophet must wander about as strangers in foreign lands, seeking guidance from Yahweh, but failing to find him. The people will fall, never again to rise. This is his plan for the wicked, to destroy them utterly. The fifth and final vision of Amos is the destruction of the sanctuary, and it begins in chapter 9. Naturally, the story culminates with the destruction of Yahweh's temple. Such an event would have been unthinkable, so its occurrence would leave a surviving populace in stunned grief, its reality shaking them to the core. No other part of their history, including their own captivity, could scar them so deeply. Amos sees Yahweh standing beside the altar, a vision which is typically only afforded to the high priest, and the patron deity declares that he will strike the threshold of the temple, shattering it over the heads of the people, striking them down. These survivors he will slay with the sword, and none shall escape his wrath. Even those who flee will be killed as they attempt to dig down into Sheol or climb into heaven. This places the twin realms of the spiritual world firmly in their reality, as we saw in the Tower of Babel's story, as men could build a tower which would allow them to reach the cloudy courtyard of the gods. No matter where they hide themselves, Yahweh will track them down. Those hidden on mountaintops will fall by the sword, and those at the bottom of the sea will be devoured by dragons. Beginning in verse 5, we're treated to declarations concerning the power and grandeur of Yahweh Sabaoth. He is the Lord of the heavenly army, captain of all the gods. He touches the earth and it melts, imagery straight out of Zoroastrian eschatology. He built the upper chambers of heaven and set the foundations of the firmament on earth, a reference to the creation story in Genesis chapter 1, which in turn was based on the Babylonian Enuma Elish. He brings up floodwaters from the sea and dumps them upon the earth, returning it to the primordial chaos before order was established. Even the same phrasing is used here as he speaks of water over the face of the world, which was seen in Genesis 1. He then threatens to destroy the sinful people from the world, but a remnant of the house of Jacob will be preserved. Following this is a brief epilogue that concludes chapter 9 and the Book of Amos. Beginning in verse 11, we have the promise of a restoration under a Davidic king. The fallen booth of the blessed will be raised up, its ruins restored and rebuilt as in days of old, so they can seize the remnant of the Edomites. So Yahweh is not only promising this people a brighter future, but they'll possess their neighbors as slaves. The mountains and hills will run with wine, and the cities of Israel will be rebuilt. Vineyards and gardens will be planted, and the residents of the land will reap the harvest, and they'll occupy the land forever, never again to be uprooted, because Yahweh, their patron deity, has proclaimed it so. Of course, this forever which Yahweh has promised won't last very long, as history tells us. If the book of Joel could be called a pamphlet in the last episode, that statement is even more true of the book of Obadiah. Clocking in at a mere 21 verses, the book of Obadiah isn't even long enough to be divided into chapters. So when I say something like Obadiah 1 through 7, I'm not referring to the first 7 chapters, as I would be if I were speaking about other books in the Bible, but the first 7 verses. Which brings me to my next point. The book of Obadiah is neatly divided into 3 parts, each of which are exactly 7 verses long. It follows a familiar pattern common in the prophetic material: prophecy of destruction, reason for destruction, fall, and restoration. What makes Obadiah different from other prophetic works is its focus. While most are centered on the sins of Judah, Obadiah is concerned with the crimes of Edom. One purpose of this focus is to contrast the fates of these two nations. As Edom falls, Judah is restored. Of course, the author ignores the timeline discrepancy, as Edom fell to the Babylonians around the same time as Judah, and Judah's restoration occurred generations later. But this book isn't about historical accuracy. It's about using historical events to teach a theological lesson. As with all prophetic works, it's about inciting a religious change within the audience. Also, the Book of Obadiah isn't exactly about Edom. Edom is a stand-in for Judah, as we'll soon see. As stated before, Obadiah is short, only 440 words, and is the shortest book in the Hebrew Bible, and the fourth shortest in the combined Old and New Testaments, beaten only by 3 New Testament epistles, those being Philemon, 2 John, and 3 John. Dating the text is difficult. Portions of the text resemble portions of Jeremiah, namely chapter 49, and some have suggested that one book borrowed from the other, while other scholars have indicated that both Jeremiah and Obadiah borrowed from a common source. Of course, Obadiah's mention of Judah's restoration leads us to believe a later authorship. The book begins with a vision of Yahweh delivered to the prophet Obadiah concerning the nation of Edom. Messengers are sent through the nations that Edom will be utterly destroyed. This is the decree of Edom's fall, which comprises the first third of the book. The crime which has incited Yahweh's wrath is that of pride. It's the same crime levied against the temple priests in Judah and the rebellious angels. And like those angels, the nation of Edom is said to have soared with eagles and set their nest among the stars, but for their pride they have been brought down. The first section of Obadiah ends by stating that Edom's ruin has already come to pass. The nation has already been pillaged, and their allies have deceived them. Just as Edom has betrayed its neighbor Israel, so too will it be betrayed by its neighbor, and without allies it will fall. And just as the author uses the same accusation against Edom as was used against temple priests, so too are we to understand that this is as much about Judah as the people of Edom. This message is meant for those living in and around Jerusalem so they might change their ways, and the sins of Edom is actually a reference to the accusations levied against theological opponents in Jerusalem. By painting them in the same light as their national opponents, the author can more easily sway his audience to his own way of thinking. We've seen this rhetoric before as reformers accuse older forms of Yahwism to be Canaanite and idolatrous, while only the newer forms of worship are considered to be pure. So here in Obadiah, when we read about Edom, we should understand it as the old Yahweh cult in Jerusalem. And when we read of Judah, we should understand that as the new settlers from Babylon who are building a new society atop the ruins of their ancestors. The second third of Obadiah, Edom's betrayal of Judah, begins in verse 8 and concludes with verse 14. It begins with a phrase we've come to recognize in the prophetic works, a reference to the day of judgment. He then goes on to announce plans for the impending destruction of Edom, beginning with those who think themselves wise. This too has been seen before in a reference to Judah, as the wise have misled the population of the land, causing them to sin by accepting other gods and idols of Yahweh. Here they have misled the people of Mount Esau, and so the people shall be cut off from Yahweh. For the crime of standing aside while Jerusalem was being raided and its people carried off, Edom shall suffer the same fate as its neighbor. For the crime of rejoicing over the fate of Jerusalem, Edom too will be handed over into captivity. The last 7 verses contrast the fall of Edom with the restoration of Judah. Yahweh expands his wrath to include all of the nations. Some national karma kicks in, and they can expect the treatment of others to be visited upon their own heads. Those who drink and rejoice in the downfall of their neighbors shall have their own neighbors celebrate at their destruction. As Edom celebrated the fall of Jerusalem, those on Mount Zion will celebrate the destruction of Edom. And the survivors of Edom will be carried off by the Judahites to serve as slaves, just as those from Judah had once been slaves to Babylon. Judah will be a cleansing flame that burns away the land of Edom, leaving no survivors in the land, just as Nebuchadnezzar served as Yahweh's wrathful flame in the previous books. The nearby lands will be divided up amongst the people, and the chosen will rule from Mount Zion, and Yahweh will serve as their king. This mention of a surviving remnant betrays the subject of the oracle. This isn't about Edom, as Edom isn't supposed to have any survivors. Instead, this oracle is about Judah, as we saw in Isaiah when the same term, remnant, is used to describe those who survive but are carted off into captivity in Babylon. And as we saw in Isaiah, a remnant will be placed on Zion to experience a national restoration under a divine king. That's going to wrap it up for this episode. You can help the show by giving a review on your favorite podcast app or by heading over to dragonsofgenesis.com, where you can find a link to donate, join my Patreon, send books from my wish list, find a list of recommended reading, and get information on the latest episodes. And as always, thank you for listening.